You can also restrict resource access from the internet by location of source. Like for example, if you have, I'm residing, I was born in Romania and still live in Romania. Like for example, if the government has a service which is publicly available to all of the country's citizens, whatever the service is. For example, the government can actually configure a network access policy so that that service is reachable only from IPs within the country, not outside of the country. Because most of the times the denial of service attacks or distributed denial of service attacks have sources from different regions of the world, and most of the times it's outside of the country where the victim is. So the victim resides in, let's say, US or Romania or I don't know, Spain, let's say, but then the sources of the attack are all over the globe. So if the resource being available to the users should be available only within the country, then it makes sense to deploy such kind of network security policy based on the location of the source to allow or disallow access. So it's very basic and very efficient. Otherwise, you can implement intelligence into network that learns network behavior. So in the case, for example, that you cannot restrict access to a public resource from specific IPs, like from your own country, because it has to be publicly available. Then you can deploy what is called some kind of application level firewalls as well, which are going to be deployed in the network. They learn the network behavior. They see what is the regular legitimate traffic pattern towards a specific service which is publicly available. Also, they can learn from which sources do users in general access that service, and in which time intervals. Is it mostly in the morning, in the evening, in the afternoon? So it is going to learn the behavior of users accessing that specific resource. And when a distributed denial of service happens, then that traffic pattern is going to be no longer met. Because at that point it's going to be a simultaneous number of huge amount of sessions from different sources in the globe that have not seen before by that intelligence in the network. So at that point, that specific tool what can do, because it's going to detect abnormal behavior, abnormal requests towards the protected resource, it can block those. It can block those instantly. Or can, if it's a web server, what a lot of security technologies vendors do, if it's a web service, and if that intelligence in the network identifies an abnormal number of requests towards the web service, on the fly is going to change the web page to ask the users to put in the web page captcha, or to put in the web page specific strings in order to be provided with the content they're trying to access. Sometimes though it takes very long time to actually stop a DDoS attack. Like for example, as it was the case with those two attacks I have shown you, which the problem was not how the attack was deployed, by using DNS reflection or by using Amazon Web Services and then putting up to live a lot of virtual machines as sources of the attacks. The problem of those two attacks was not the mechanism of the attack, but the problem was the high bandwidth of the attack, which you can imagine that a regular company organization has like tens of megs or hundreds of megs or maybe 1-2 gigs of access to the internet. But if the attack reaches hundreds of gigabits per second or even terabits per second, then the network is going to be flooded with too much traffic, and there's pretty much nothing to be done at that point. The only way to prevent against high bandwidth denial of service attacks is to actually At that point, you have to escalate the problem to the internet service providers so they can actually identify the sources of the attacks and block the attacks, the sources, because they have to block that specific bandwidth. Now, other types of such let's say other types of mitigation tools which you can use for high bandwidth attacks is the following. So, for example, if you have the attacker which from multiple endpoints, endpoint 1, 2, and so on until endpoint n, sends a huge amount of data to your web server. So it's a bandwidth denial of service attacks, 700 gigabits per second. What you can do, there are specific companies and specific providers that offer the following service. So if the public IP of the server was, let's say, 1111, then what you can do is you can reroute internet traffic for 11111 towards that specific provider. So that way you're going to reroute internet traffic towards the specific denial of service. DDoS or DOS is going to be basically DDoS attack prevention. You're going to make sure that in the internet packets destined to 111 are going to be routed towards this specific entity. So that entity is going to receive 700 gigabits per second of attack. But it has enough bandwidth to sustain that amount of data. And then that, let's say, that provider is going to clean up the traffic and reroute back to you, to the real service, only valid or legitimate traffic. So at this point, what's going to happen, your ingress network point on the internet is not going to be overloaded by 700 gigabits per second. You're only going to receive valid traffic after all of the traffic, of which was 700 gigabits per second, was cleaned up by that provider that can actually sustain huge amount of traffic and requests and clean that up. So there's a question from user, how to stop DDoS with minimal impact to the customer. As I was saying, now a DDoS, it depends again on the, like for example, what I'm trying to say is the following. In most cases, there are very few companies that are going to afford to invest the required money to protect against the DDoS from happening. Okay? Because in order to prevent against such a DDoS, you have limited options, as we've seen. Because if the DDoS is based on high bandwidth, pretty much the only thing you can do is either escalate to the provider. So what is gonna happen is that in the internet, providers are gonna speak one to each other, detect the source of the attacks, and then stop the attack. But that takes time. Or you can have an agreement. You can buy services from those kind of companies that can actually sustain huge amount of data, so that you actually redirect traffic destined to your to the victim, to those companies. They receive all traffic, they clean it up, and they send back to you only legitimate traffic. But you can imagine that service costs huge amount of money, and at that point only few companies actually are going to afford to invest that amount of money. So it's to answer your question, how to stop a DDoS with minimal impact to the customer. First of all, the customer, you have to define against which type of DDoS attack do you want to protect. Is that an application attack? Is that a service attack? Is that a bandwidth attack? So it's several types of DDoS attacks. And then based on the type of the DDoS attack, Sometimes as this is the one with the bandwidth, it requires too much money to invest to protect against that kind of attack, and the company may not find the use case. Like if the whole company, let's say, is worth at, I don't know, $1 million, for example, would you invest $300,000 a year for DDoS attacks prevention? Not really, right? Because at that point, what you're gonna do, you're just gonna make use of you're gonna leave yourself open to such DDoS attacks and escalate it to the providers and stop the attack within a certain amount of time, which means, yes, your services will be down for a certain amount of time, your public image will be affected, and all those kind of things, but you don't have enough financial power to invest in the required solutions. And one of the problems with the DDoS attacks is that in most cases, whatever you do, you're never 100% protected like against any other kind of attacks. Because remember what we were saying, that it doesn't matter what kind of attack you want to protect against, you can never reach 100% protection, even assuming you have the financial power to do that. Because it's always new things that show up, new ways, new attacks, new tools, new vulnerabilities, new ways of launching attacks, which nobody was aware before, and nobody had had any countermeasures to stop those attacks. So that at a certain point, it's well known within the community of security experts, for example, that most companies are gonna aim to provide for the relevant assets that are, let's say, valuable to their company. They're going to end up providing up to 70, 80, or maybe a bit more level of protection. Remaining of 10, 15, 20, 30% is going to be accepted risk, because it takes too many resources and too much money to invest to cover up as more of that 30% or 20% of gap which you are exposed to. And either way, you can never ever touch 100%. Alex says, how does the provider know what traffic is valid to perform filtering? Because I'm going to show you in a couple that in this, it depends on how that high bandwidth attack is being deployed. We're going to speak in a couple about reflection attacks and amplification attacks, which is going to answer your question. Because it can happen that most of the times that type of traffic, which ends up consuming the bandwidth of the victim towards the internet, those are not valid requests for services of the user. So what is going to end up happening, I'm going to show you in a couple about amplification or reflection attacks. What happens is that, as I was saying, if the target of the attack, it's a high bandwidth type of attack, and if the target is 1111, and you configure running in the network so that all of the attacks from the infected endpoints are going to be rerouted to that provider, which can actually clean up the traffic. So if you can reroute the traffic to that provider, so all traffic is being sent to that provider, and that provider reroutes back to you only legitimate or valid traffic. If the DDoS attack is based on reflection or amplification, this traffic is going to be something like NTP traffic or DNS traffic, which is not even legitimate requests, as we're going to see. Which means that what's going to happen is that as this provider receives all of that traffic, it is just going to drop it, because that's not useful traffic from the client's point of view. So Alex, let me know if I've answered your question, because I know what you mean. It's not like this type of solution doesn't work in the attacks where the attack is actually a valid request towards a service which is publicly available from that organization. Like as I was saying, if this was a DDoS attack, but with legitimate requests asking, hey, give me this web resource, then you cannot make use of this specific solution with the provider to filter that traffic, because indeed the provider is not aware, which resources are available on your website or on your web server or on your FTP server. So it depends.